some inflation has some benefits. It encourages economic activity. If people think prices are going to rise in the future, they're more likely to buy today. And as Chris Flowers says, it does help debtors because you can pay what you owe later with dollars that are worth less. So your money goes a little bit farther that way. And other people have been suggesting that we do something along those lines. And finally, if you get a little bit of inflation, it helps incent companies to invest because they look at something called the real rate. What are they paying for money after inflation? And here's an example. If you look at 1% in interest rate and a 2% rate of inflation, your real rate is negative 1% because you're subtracting inflation from the interest rate. But if you have 0% inflation, which is what we're close to now, you have a 1% interest rate, it's not as good for you. The problem is you don't want deflation. We are seeing many countries fighting that off at this point. That's harder to get out of because there's no real incentive for that the Federal Reserve or other central banks can use. Central bank orthodoxy since the 1970s, when we had the big inflation scares, that inflation is always terrible. And so they're more bent on fighting that than allowing too much extra inflation.
Okay, so as far as which fear you can bring upon people first, which is stronger, inflation or deflation?
Well, right now it seems more people are worried about deflation. Most of the large economies of the world are experiencing declining inflation rates. We call that disinflation. They don't want to get into a deflationary period like Japan has gotten into because it is, as I say, very, very hard to get out of. Deflation is a terrible tax on people because not only do they stop buying because they think prices are going to fall, but then wages start to go down and you start to see this spiral lower. But because you can't affect the real rate, you don't really have a way to automatically get out of it, a lever you can pull.
All right, now how would central banks go about creating inflation, should they wish to?
You could do like the traditional way of just flooding the economy with money, and that's what the Bank of Japan is going to try to do, the old Milton Friedman thing of too much money chasing too few goods, and they hope that's going to raise the price level. Or you can try to influence inflation expectations, kind of like what the Fed's doing with its July 2015 promise to keep rates steady even if the economy picks up. Now, some people say we should go beyond that and target nominal GDP, which is non-inflation adjusted GDP. If you think you got a 2% growth rate, then if you're going to have a 4% target, you automatically assume, investors in theory assume you're going to have 2% inflation, and that helps move things higher. But at this point, a lot of problems with that. How do you exactly do it, especially since they revise GDP all the time? How do you know what the number actually is?
But
it's something that's getting a little more traction. More people talking about it these days because they're worried about disinflation. They want to get the economies going, and as we say, a little bit of inflation can be good for the economy.